If you have a Bible, I encourage you to take it out and turn it to the book of Matthew. We begin a new series this morning called Tough Questions. Matthew chapter 23 is where we'll be. Tough Questions. We are going to be looking at some questions that people ask concerning the Christian faith that maybe sometimes it causes people to doubt these questions. Sometimes it is used by people to kind of say the Christian faith is not real. It's not something worth trusting in or thinking about because of these are questions that are difficult to answer sometimes or maybe very important to answer to help us to think about our faith. And so we're going to talk about these for the next 5 weeks, about some of these tough questions. And the first one we are going to talk about today is the idea of hypocrisy. Why are there so many hypocrites in the church? That's the question. Now, I got a question for you. The question is how many of you in here know a hypocrite? Nobody's willing to? Okay, all right. All right, yeah. That's the second question. The second question is how many of you are a hypocrite? Now, you know, that's kind of a joke. I was going to ask how many of you are married to a hypocrite, but we're trying to strengthen marriages. We're not trying to hurt those marriages. But at any rate, how many of you have ever heard someone say, I'm not going to go to church. Maybe you've said it. I'm not going to go to church, or I'm not going to go to that church because there are so many hypocrites there. Have you ever heard somebody say that? Yeah, okay. Now, I think that, and we'll talk about this in a minute, I think that is a little bit of an excuse for why you wouldn't go. I mean, if you really think about it, there are hypocrites at the Tennessee football games. There are hypocrites at the store, at Walmart. You know, they're all over the place. We are all over the place. But to some degree, you have to admit, they do have a little bit of a point. I mean, there are a lot of hypocrites, or should I say there are a lot of hypocritical people in the church. And the reason is, and maybe this is kind of, you know, showing my cards too early, but the reason is because there are a lot of people in the church who the Bible says are sinful people. We are sinful people. And so, to some degree, we are hypocritical. But the reason I bring this up is because one of the things that seemingly keeps people from following Christ is the hypocrisy of the people who claim to follow him. It's supposedly Gandhi considered converting to Christianity. He was Hindu. He considered converting to Christianity, but he was put off, supposedly, by Christians that he interacted with in South Africa, specifically a racial issue there in South Africa. And he said this, he said, I like your Christ, but I don't like your Christians. And so because of that, he rejected Christianity. So we ask the question today, why are there so many hypocrites in the church? Now, interestingly, Jesus had something to say about this, and I don't think it'll shock you to know that Jesus hated hypocrisy more than anyone. So look with me in Matthew chapter 23, verse number 1. We're going to read through to verse number 13. He says this, Then Jesus spoke to the crowds and to his disciples. The scribes and the Pharisees are seated in the chair of Moses. We'll explain what that is in just a minute. Therefore, do whatever they tell you and observe it. But don't do what they do, because they don't practice what they teach. They tie up heavy loads that are hard to carry and put them on people's shoulders, but they themselves aren't willing to lift a finger to move them. They do everything to be seen by others. They enlarge their phylacteries and lengthen their tassels. They love the place of honor at banquets, the front seats in the synagogues, greetings in the marketplaces, and to be called rabbi by the people. But you are not to be called rabbi, because you have one teacher, and you are all brothers and sisters. Do not call anyone on earth your father. He doesn't mean that literally, as in don't call your dad father. but it's more of recognition of a particular title that's above everybody else, is his idea there. Because you have one Father, capital F, who is in heaven. You are not to be called instructors either. That's the same concept, same idea. Because you have one capital I instructor, the Messiah. The greatest among you will be your servant. Whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and whoever humbles himself will be exalted. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites. Now, what is a hypocrite? Well, the word hypocrite in the Greek language from which the Bible is written, it comes from the theater. It means an actor. Literally, it was someone who would come out on stage during a play, and they would put on or hold up a mask over their face to play a character. So it's not necessarily a negative term in the original sense of the language, but it becomes negative whenever it's talking about a person who is play acting in life. In other words, they are someone who is pretending to be something that they are not. An actor wearing a mask is pretending to be a character that they really aren't. So Jesus is talking about those people who pretend to be something or someone that they aren't. In this case, Jesus is talking about someone who pretends to be right with God, but isn't. Now, they may be intentionally deceptive, trying to make people think that they're right with God when they really aren't. So they may know that they're not right with God, but they are trying to make everybody else think that they're right with God, so they're intentionally being deceptive. Or they could be self-deceptive, or self-deceived, I should say. That is, that they think that they're right with God, but they really aren't, because they're trusting in the wrong things to make them right with God. And so they are hypocritical and acting as a hypocrite because they think they're right with God when they're really not, and they're acting that way out. Does that make sense? In other words, they have an outward appearance, but no inward devotion to God. Now, Jesus gives two characteristics in this passage of what a hypocrite is. So the first one is this: they don't practice what they preach. They don't practice what they preach. So look in verse 1. Then Jesus spoke to the crowds and to his disciples. The scribes and the Pharisees are seated in the chair of Moses. We'll explain that in a minute. Therefore, do whatever they tell you and observe it, but don't do what they do, because they don't practice what they teach. Now, in other words, they say one thing, but they do another thing. Now, the religious leaders, the Pharisees and the scribes, the religious leaders in the Jewish faith in the first century, they sat in something known as the chair of Moses. Now, the chair of Moses was a literal chair in the synagogue, and when they would teach, they wouldn't stand up behind a pulpit like this, or on a platform necessarily. They would sit in a chair, and they would teach, and everyone would sit around them and would listen. And that chair was known as the chair of Moses. But it really stood for more of symbolically, as a position of authority and responsibility to teach the law of Moses. So it kind of symbolized for them what their role was in the synagogue, that they are supposed to explain the law of Moses, the Old Testament, specifically the first 5 books, but really all of the Old Testament. They're supposed to explain that for the people and teach that to the people so that the people could then obey God's law. So that's why Jesus says, when they teach you the law of Moses, do what they tell you that the law of Moses says. Whenever they're explaining that and they tell you to do something that the law of Moses says, then you do it. But he says, don't imitate their lives, because they don't do what they tell you to do. Jesus said that they tie up heavy burdens. Look what he says in verse number 4. He says they tie up heavy burdens or heavy loads that are hard to carry and put them on people's shoulders, but they aren't themselves willing to lift a finger to move them. So what's interesting is that the Pharisees and the scribes, the religious leaders, would not just give people the biblical commands to do. They would create man-made commands to help the people follow the biblical commands. I'll give you an example. So in the law, in the Big Ten, the Ten Commandments, one of the Ten Commandments is to keep the Sabbath holy, right? Keep the Sabbath holy, and it says that nobody should do any work on the Sabbath so that you can take the day to focus on God and on worshiping God and give it a time of rest. So there's no work that's supposed to be done on the Sabbath. And so what the Pharisees and scribes did was they created a command that you weren't allowed to spit in the dirt on the Sabbath, because if you wiped it away with your foot, it would be considered plowing, which would be considered work. Okay, that's kind of the idea. So the command is keep the Sabbath holy. The man-made command is don't spit in the dirt on the Sabbath. Now this still goes on today. When I went to Israel, well, both times, but when I went to Israel some years back, they have something in every hotel known as the Shabbat elevator. So Shabbat is the Hebrew word for Sabbath. It's the Sabbath elevator. And the Sabbath elevator, when you get on, you don't have to push any buttons to go to the floors. It stops at every floor on the way up and then goes all the way down and stops at every floor. It just automatically does that. And they do that so that on the Sabbath, you don't have to go and push any buttons, which would be considered work. Okay? I kind of like the Sabbath elevator myself, but, you know, it is what it is. Okay? But that's kind of what they do. They created 1,000 of these little technical micro rules that people had to follow. And it would be exhausting for a normal, everyday Jew to try to keep all of these meticulous rules. And then, when somebody messed up and they didn't keep the rule, there would be absolutely no grace for them. There's no mercy, no encouragement, there's no practical help. There's strict judges rather than helpful shepherds. So they don't practice what they preach. The second characteristic is they do everything to be seen by others. Look in verse number 5. He says they do everything to be seen by others. Straight out of Jesus' mouth. They enlarge their phylacteries and lengthen their tassels. They love the place of honor at banquets, the front seats in the synagogues, greetings in the marketplaces, and to be called rabbi by the people. Now, phylacteries were prayer boxes that they wore on their hand or their arm. It comes from a command in the book of Deuteronomy about God telling through Moses the people to keep his word like bound, like near them, like it's bound to their hand and keep it between their eyes. And so these prayer boxes contained tiny copies of the Old Testament scriptures that they would put in there, and they would literally bind it to their hand through straps, and they would wrap it. Maybe you've seen some of them praying, and they will wrap these big, long leather straps, and they have a box on their arm or on their hand, and some of them will wrap it around their head, and it will, while they're praying, they will literally have a box of tiny scriptures between their eyes. Now, I think in Deuteronomy, he's speaking metaphorically, obviously. Like, you know, in other words, don't literally bind it to yourself, but keep it before you at all times. Why the back of the hand? Because, have you ever heard the phrase, I know them like the back of my hand, okay, because you kind of always see them, okay? That's kind of the idea. But they took it literally, and they literally did that. And then they just made the straps longer and bigger and the boxes more ornate, and it became a symbol of piety. Oh, look how big their phylacteries are. Okay? Now, you're like, well, that doesn't make any sense to me. Maybe it's the common or the modern day kind of equivalent would be that, and I hate, this is not really a great example because there are people who genuinely do this, but maybe, you know, they wear a big cross necklace, or, you know, like a big Jesus t-shirt, or a really big fish on the back of your car, Jesus fish, okay? And I hesitate to use that because people are genuinely devoted to God who do that, but imagine doing that when they're just trying to make everybody think that they're right with God. That's kind of the idea, okay? You following me so far? Okay, good. 3 of you are great. All right. So, the phylacteries, the prayer boxes, but then he says the tassels, that they lengthen their tassels, the fringes on their prayer shawls. They had like fringes that had knots in them, and they would use them to kind of rub together to think about their prayers, kind of like similar to what rosary beads are kind of. They're handled, they're counted as the prayers are recited. And both of those, long tassels, big phylacteries, became a badge of status and this showy display that tried to impress other people how spiritual they were. They loved to be recognized at banquets. They wanted to sit on the platform during the church services so they could be noticed. They wanted to be in places of honor and recognition that fed their feeling of importance and authority and need. They loved to be called rabbi, which ended up being a term that meant master, but literally it comes from the Hebrew word that means my great one. So they loved to be called the great one. Oh, there goes the great ones right there. They love those recognition. They love to be noticed. They want people to think they're right with God, but they are not. Here's what they are. They're pretenders. Now, there may be some things that we do that does not flow from a heart that is devoted to God, but rather it's a desire for people to think that we are spiritual. So, if you want an answer to the question of why there's so many hypocrites in the church, I think that's what we can say. I think the answer to that question is that a hypocrite is someone who wants to appear one way while being another way because, listen, they care more about what others think rather than what God thinks. Listen to what Psalm 139 says. It's not on the screen, so you're just going to have to listen. First part of Psalm 139 says this. David is writing, he says, Lord, you have searched me and known me. You know when I sit down and when I stand up. You understand my thoughts far away. You observe my travels and my rest. You are aware of all my ways. Did you understand that God is aware of all your ways? Nothing that you do happens in the shadow. It may happen in the shadow of other people, but God knows all your ways. Before a word is on my tongue, you know all about it, Lord. God knows what you're going to say before you say it. And so all of us think about this idea of pretending to be one way because we care more about what people think rather than what God thinks. And that is the reason there are hypocrites and hypocritical people when it comes in the church. But I think this brings up another question that we really need to answer. And that is, what do we do about the hypocrites? Just kick them out. Just kick them out. No, I'm kidding. I think the better question is really, what do we do about the hypocrisy? What do we do about hypocrisy in the church? Well, if you are a follower of Jesus, this is what Jesus is communicating. And here's kind of the main idea here. If you're a follower of Jesus, this is not true. This is not true if you're not a follower of Jesus. And I'll explain in just a minute. But if you are a follower of Jesus, true faith isn't about appearing perfect, but about being authentic. Do you know what Jesus wants with your life? If you follow him, authenticity. Realness. He wants a genuine faith. Now, the reason I say this isn't for people who don't follow Jesus is because just faith that is an authentic faith is not what Jesus is after. Faith in him that is an authentic faith is what Jesus is after. You can't just have faith in something, in anything, and say, well, I'm authentic about what I believe, and it'd be okay. You have to have a faith in Jesus that then is not just about being or appearing a certain way, but it's a real, deep heart, soul, deep down in you, real faith that you then live out and not just something that you say, that you talk about. I remember one of the first things that someone told me after I surrendered to the ministry. My pastor told me the very first thing he would say, be real, because there are already too many fakes in the church. Be real. If I could just say anything to you, if you are a Christian, be real. Be a real one. Be genuine about what you say you believe and about how you live. So let me give you a couple of pointers, instructions taken directly from Jesus to apply this, and then we're going to be done. Number one, practice what you preach. Okay? Practice what you preach. Don't talk one way and live another. Don't pretend to be something that you're not. Don't act one way on Sunday and another way on Monday through Saturday. Don't give lip service to God. Don't let there be a gap between what you profess and what you live out. In other words, let the inside match the outside. In fact, what Jesus says is to let the inside depict what is on the outside. Listen what he says in verse 25. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! You clean the outside of the cup and dish, but inside they are full of greed and self-indulgence. Blind Pharisee, first clean the inside of your cup so that the outside may become clean also. We do it the opposite. We want to clean the outside, hoping that it cleans the inside. And that's not how Jesus said it happens. Jesus said it happens by letting him clean the inside so that what is the inside will come out and will reflect on the outside. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, verse 27, you're like whitewashed tombs, which appear beautiful on the outside, but inside they're full of the bones of the dead and every kind of impurity. I'm going to stop there, but you get the idea. Clean the inside. Let Jesus clean the outside, or the inside, so that the outside will also be clean. That's how you really get clean. So practice what you preach. The second thing is this: do everything for an audience of one. Care more about what God thinks than what people think. And I'm constantly fighting this in my own life. Just so you know, your pastor is on the same level as you. Constantly fighting because I want to care more about what God thinks than what people think, but many times I find myself caring more about what people think rather than what God thinks. Would anybody kind of say, I join you, Pastor, I'm with you there? Okay, yeah. Let me just say, who cares? Who cares if people think you're a Christian when you're really not? You're not going to be standing before other people to give an account of your life before you die. We can try to keep up appearances, but as Psalm 139 said, God knows our hearts. And we are badly deceived if we think that we can deceive God about who we really are. So the main issue, I think, is pride. Because when we pretend, it's because pride. We wear masks. We make people think we're better than we are because there's a pride issue that's going on. And I think the answer to pride, Jesus says, is a really good dose of humility. In fact, skip down to verse 11 on the slide if you don't care if it's up there. Look what he says. The greatest among you will be your servant. Whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and whoever humbles himself will be exalted. So just be real. Jesus resists the proud, but he gives grace to the humble. Just be real and walk in the light. Just be real in who you say that you are in your faith in Christ, and just walk in the light. Okay, so that's Christians. Let me just speak for just a minute to those who maybe use hypocrites or hypocritical people as an excuse not to follow Jesus. The standard for the truth and validity of Christianity is not other Christians, but Jesus. It's not what other Christians do, but it's who Jesus is. So a group of hypocritical Christians, even though they may be a reality, a group of hypocritical Christians doesn't make Jesus any less holy, any less good, any less loving, or any less worthy of our surrender. Like I said, you won't stand before another Christian on the day of judgment. You will stand before a perfect Jesus. A Jesus who is perfect, but out of his love died on the cross in your place for your sin. A Jesus who deserves your complete devotion. So don't let a group of hypocritical Christians keep you from following the Jesus who deserves your life. Have you ever heard of a man named Charles Templeton? If you're maybe a little bit longer in the tooth than others, you probably have. Has anybody ever heard of a man named Billy Graham? Billy Graham and Charles Templeton were contemporaries. They worked together as evangelists, and Billy Graham actually said that Charles Templeton was one of the most gifted evangelists in the world at the time. And Billy said he's a better preacher than I am. Better speaker, better preacher. But he began to have doubts about the Christian faith. He had some issues with questions like this, but he also had some issues with some of the actions by so-called Christians. And sadly, he ended up leaving the faith. And to our knowledge, he died an unbeliever. Lee Strobel, a former journalist from the Chicago Tribune, wrote a book called The Case for Faith. And in that, he interviewed Charles Templeton to ask him about his journey in leaving the faith. And he expected Charles Templeton to speak bitterly about Jesus. But it was interesting what happened. In the introduction to his book, when Strobel asked Templeton about Jesus, he says that Charles Templeton grew quiet, his eyes filled with tears, and after a long pause, he said Jesus was the greatest human being who has ever lived. He said he was morally perfect and compassionate, and then he was overcome with emotion, and here's what he said. Through tears, he said, "And I miss him." Now, I tell you that story to say that Christians are going to fail you. Pastors are going to fail you. Churches are going to disappoint you, but Jesus never will. So don't let the hypocrisy of some so-called Christians keep you from Jesus, because he'll never let you down.